In the decades since independence, India's achievements have fueled the narrative of a country on the rise. In awe inspiring displays since 1951, hundreds of millions of Indians have gone to the polls every 5 years to select their leaders. Starting in the 1980s, India also captured the world's imagination as a potential superpower. At the start of this 75-year journey, India faced three challenges: to breathe new life into the agricultural sector, provide good urban jobs, and compete in the international marketplace. At the end of this journey, India faces three challenges: to breathe new life into an ailing agricultural sector, provide many more jobs in an economy that seems chronically unable to create jobs, and to compete in a much tougher international setting. The country's democracy, having betrayed the economic aspirations of millions of its citizens, no longer protects the fundamental rights and freedoms of Indians. A blanket of violence is falling over the nation. The norms of equality, tolerance, and shared progress have disappeared. That is the rather depressing conclusion that Ashok Mody reaches in his new book, India is Broken, A People Betrayed, 1947 to Today. Ashok Mody is an economic historian at Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. He's formerly worked at the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Welcome to Scroll Books, Mr. Modi.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Naresh, for having me.
I have to confess that I found your book unremittingly grim reading, as you detail the many betrayals, as you describe them, that Indians have experienced since independence. Narendra Modi was elected to power in 2014 on the hope that he would reverse many of what see were historical blunders, both economic and social. Let's start with the BJP's economic initiatives. How do you evaluate them?
So, the economic initiatives are best summarized by a phrase that became very popular in 2014 called the Gujarat model of development. That's the overarching economic philosophy of this government. Now, to be clear, the Gujarat model of development precedes Narendra Modi and the BJP government. That model essentially is one in which corporate interests get a free hand, in which they are given access to relatively inexpensive land resources, and they are able to exploit natural resources and typically disregard environmental concerns. Narendra Modi's genius was to put that model on steroids, and that somehow caught the imagination of Indian intellectuals from left to right, that this will generate very rapid growth. Growth becomes the mantra. Somehow there is this magical animal called GDP growth, which is going to solve all of India's problems. What I continue to be mystified by is where are jobs in all of this? Where is agriculture in all of this? Even today, more than 40% of Indians rely on agriculture. A vast bulk of urban Indians work in the informal sector, where if they have jobs, they are precarious jobs. The, the sentence that you read out in your opening from my book is this was the challenge in 1947 to raise agricultural productivity and create good urban jobs. As best I can see, over this time, no prime minister has been able to do that. And there are two essential things that no one else has also done. It is a historical fact that since the time of the Industrial Revolution, almost 350 years ago, to today, no country has made progress, not one single country, without educating its people through a good primary and secondary education system and without bringing more women into the workforce. I'm making the assertion that there is no historical example of a country that has made progress without these two factors. And that has been our consistent failure. We still don't educate our children well. We may have the IITs, as you may know. I myself am from an IIT. My wife is from an IIT. I'm a beneficiary of this system. I'm part of the first world elite that Indians have become, some Indians have become part of. But the vast majority of Indians receive a poor education. And what makes me particularly sad is the status of women in this country. The share of women in the workforce has, if anything, fallen over the last 15 or 20 years. And there is not one single Indian leader who has been able to deal with these problems. Until we deal with these problems, the Indian economy will not be competitive. And as long as the Indian economy is not competitive, we will not produce globally competitive, labor intensive exports, and then urban jobs will remain scarce and of poor quality. Just one last fact I'll give you before I stop. Today, there are more Indians employed in construction than in the manufacturing sector. And that is not an accident. That is the nature of Indian development. That it has essentially been a construction and then on layered on top of that a finance-led development process. Sorry, I said I would stop, but I'm sorely tempted to say, just by way of example, what I'm describing to you about the model. Joshimath is sinking, as you probably know. The sinking of Joshimath is completely symbolic of the development pattern that we have followed. A utter disregard for natural resources, for the environment, rampant construction, which makes some people extraordinarily rich, but which disregards the rights and the economic life opportunities of large numbers, and vastly unequal in its current structure and vastly inequitous in its intergenerational structure. I'll stop there.
Socially, where do you think we stand today?
Social norms have decayed tremendously. What do I mean by that? So let's roll back over here. This is why I've written the book as a history rather than as a commentary on any one individual prime minister. The the what I call the arc of moral degradation begins already in the Nehru period. Nehru, I keep emphasizing, was a man who believed in the ideals of equality, tolerance, and shared progress. Unfortunately, he did not practice any of them in terms of the policy structure that he put in place. What happened, therefore, was that a, a layer of corruption began to envelop the Indian system already by the time Nehru ji finished his prime ministership. PWD contracts, Even the judicial system. There was something called the Santanam Committee report in 1964, which said that even the judicial system had become infected by corruption. The educational system had become infected by corruption. Teachers giving, principals giving their favored friends and relatives contracts, appointing teachers. The entire system was becoming fragile. And then, in the hands of an unprincipled politician like Mrs. Gandhi, the, the social norms went into essentially a process of decay. That is the period of the movies, The Angry Young Man. Remember, this is preceding the emergency. The films in 1971, there was unemployment, inflation, and there was an anger against the public corruption that was in place. That's when The Angry Young Man, the Amitabh Bachchan Zanjeer, and Diwar come in. This is a contrast from the Nehru early years of Awara and Shri 420, which themselves showing the problem of joblessness already at that time. Now, by the 70s, it turns into anger. In real life, it turns into the Navnirman riots in Gujarat in 1974. In other words, movies and reality are mirroring each other through this process, through this period. Okay. Mrs. Gandhi then elevates corruption to the highest level, along with her son Sanjay. And a very telling statement in Mrs. Gandhi's later years, sometime in 1983, when asked about corruption, she said corruption is a global phenomenon, which meant it's okay. So, sometime in 1791, Thomas Paine said, the long habit of not thinking a thing wrong makes it feel right. So this is what Jared Diamond calls a creeping normalcy. That yeah, ठीक है ऐसे तो सब जगह होता है. Then once that becomes ऐसे तो सब जगह होता है, then it becomes part of the structure. Then it is optimal, as an economist would say, a rational for me to cheat you before you can cheat me, and that becomes the social norm. There goes out the public accountability. And if you don't have social norms rooted in some kind of morality and a public accountability where I come before everybody else, then the policy structure begins to weaken. Then the notion that we need to create jobs for all, we need to create good jobs for all, we need to educate our children, we need to give them health care, we need to make sure that they have nutrition. Those no longer are priorities. Then the priority becomes something called GDP growth. And this GDP growth is so inimical to the whole system because it completely forgets the lived reality of people. What is the lived reality of people? Jobs, education, health, the quality of the cities they live in, the air they breathe, the water they drink, and the judicial system they encounter in their daily lives. And that is where even today, if anything, the problems have continued to become worse. I brought up Joshimath a few minutes ago. Why is Joshimath an important example? Because the problem was known in 1976. There's the Mishra Commission in 1976, which said, look, don't be silly. This area is seismically fragile. You can't treat this as a normal place to have rampant construction. And yet, for the last 50 years, we have constructed there as though it doesn't matter. Today, after people are almost on their knees For a moment, we have taken a deep breath and paused before there's another calamity. But that whole system, that when you talk about social no social problems, this is what I interpret as the issue of social norms, that a complete disregard for the other person, a lack of moral anchoring in the system. This is true of the Yamuna. The Yamuna's pollution was first noted in a serious way in 1982 in the first State of the Environment report by the Center for Science and Environment, then led by Anil Agarwal. In 1991 or thereabouts, Maneka Gandhi, who was then Environment Minister briefly under VP Singh, talked about pollution in the Yamuna. Dozens and dozens of High Court and Supreme Court decisions have reflected on the pollution of Yamuna. And yet the Yamuna remains polluted. We know what the problem is. We've known the problem for 45 years, and yet the Yamuna remains polluted. Every major river in India is dying. The river Musi runs through Hyderabad. Pharmaceutical companies have been dumping their effluents there for the last 40 years. The Musi is dead. How do we expect lives and livelihoods to achieve any kind of dignity when we have such complete disregard for what constitutes the basic core elements of lived reality?
Many Indians seem to believe, as you point out in your book, that democracy is actually the problem here. That if we had a dictator, somebody who took all the decisions in hand, we would be able to free ourselves from the clutches of all of these little problems. Where do you think that fantasy comes from, and why do we believe it, despite having had the experience of the emergency and now a phase that you call electoral autocracy?
So the short answer is I don't understand where it comes from. Uh, Let me speculate with you. I think it comes from a very high degree of elitism. The entire narrative in this country, and perhaps in other countries too, is set by an elite that lives first world lives. And for them, so let's go back to the Mrs. Gandhi period for a moment. Who are the people who celebrated the emergency? It was people like J.R.D. Tata. J.R.D. Tata spoke soon after emergency was instituted to a New York Times reporter, J. Anthony Lucas, in which he said, look, things were out of control. Now she has brought things under control. So it is this small group of people who really value the fact that their lives are placed under control. It is a very keen desire also in the elite Indian and international press. For example, the Financial Times, in applauding the potential arrival of Narendra Modi as Prime Minister sometime in 2013 or 14, said he will be able to override the normal checks and balances of democracy. I think this is almost an exact quote. I forget what it is, it's in my book. But the fact that he might be able to override the checks and balances of democracy was considered a good thing. So it's a very small elite group that feels that their lives somehow will get improved by this in this manner. And as for the rest who are not part of this group, there will be handouts and charity for them. We will give them, you know, oh, I of course, have been paying for the education of my driver. or I have been paying for the education of my maid. So there's a certain virtuosity in this process of us as individuals and as a matter of public policy giving handouts, whereas we then live very contained lives in a bubble where, yeah, things are going well. I think it's that sort of structural break that has occurred between the lives of different groups of Indians, which has created this sense, as long as my life is going well, India is doing well. You know, one of the things that I've been hearing for the last several months, oh, the payment system is so wonderful. And this explosive growth in the payment system is really going to drive an Indian growth process that will create a miracle. I want to hold my head in my hands and sob uncontrollably. I mean, doesn't anybody read any history? When was the last time a nation progressed without educating its kids and without bringing women into the workforce? How does the payment system solve the Joshimath problem, or clean up the river Musi, or educate the kids, or bring healthcare, or reduce the queues at All India Institute for all but the elite? But for a certain group of people getting off the plane from New York and being able to access the UPI, or for people over here, yeah, that's wonderful. So there is a cocoon, like, there are gateway communities, not necessarily in a physical sense, but in a sort of virtual sense. People have created these gated communities for themselves, within which, as long as there's order in that community, yeah, things are fine.
Um, what would you suggest economically and politically for India to pull away from the situation in which we now are?
I can suggest a lot of things, Naresh. None of them is going to get done. If I was czar of this country, I would say, stop all policy initiatives. Forget about these fancy semiconductor plants for which you're giving these large subsidies. Spend the next 5 years and make your education system world class. Today, there's this big debate, this big hope that as China suffers its new generation of problems, that some of the Chinese manufacturing will move to India. Again, it astonishes me how little people look at the data. The Americans are moving their stuff to Mexico. Why exactly would they move to India when they can move to Mexico? The garments, for a garment production, for example, uh, led by American companies in China, is moving to Mexico. Even there, a lot of the inputs into clothing manufacture, like threads and so on, are still coming from China. The rest is moving to Vietnam, Bangladesh, and more recently, Cambodia. There's this one Apple plant that everybody keeps talking about as a symbol. But one Apple plant, even if it materializes to the extent it is supposed to materialize according to projections, is not going to cut it. Why give this example? Why is Vietnam so far ahead of India? Sorry, it's not literally ahead in that sense. The share of Vietnam in global exports is exactly the same as that of India. And remember, Vietnam is a country of about 100 million people. Bangladesh sells more garments than India does and has done so since about 2006. What is common? Ask yourself, Naresh, what is common in all these examples? Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China, Vietnam, their kids are educated. Their women are in the workforce. That is what is common. If I had to, but this will not happen because it's not. There's no mystery to it. We all know what to be done. I mean, take the last example on the women. After that Nirbhaya event, this horrible Nirbhaya event in 2012 December, there was the Justice Verma Committee. There were women's police stations set up. Problem was identified that, especially in urban areas, violence against women is a major factor in keeping them away from the workforce. Recently, because of the 10th anniversary of the Nirbhaya event, there was a stock taking. How, how, what have we achieved in this period? On this, just this one dimension, where the social norms and accountability is broken down, you have to you have to start, so to say, from again. You have to start with rebuilding a new civic consciousness. And as I say at the close of my book, uh, Kerala's decentralization example offers the best hope. It's not perfect, it's got its own limitations. The possibility of replicating it on an India basis is far from assured. But what it does is it brings the governed and those who are governing in closer proximity to each other. And in so doing, insists on an accountability, insists on a greater consideration to the lived reality of people. And it is institutionalizing that process and then hoping that it percolates up. That is my best hope. That is my best hope for creating a broader moral revival, a moral revival that is grounded in an administrative reality, where morality is practiced as a matter of, of democratic necessity, not where democracy can easily disregard the rights of people.
Ashok Modi, thank you for talking to us. As you point out, unless India is able to pull itself out of its predicament, it isn't just India that's affected, it affects much of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naresh. I'm sorry I did not let you speak very much. I just I'm just so charged up with all this stuff right now that I couldn't resist myself at the leading questions you gave me. Thank you.